Well, the Jekyll and Hyde presidency went to Reno, Nevada today to give a speech to the American Legion Convention. It was one of those locked on the teleprompter speeches where every word Donald Trump said was written for him, and he robotically turned from one teleprompter to the other teleprompter and said nothing. Nothing controversial, nothing that could get him in trouble.
The American Legion embodies the spirit of patriotism that is the true source of our strength and the best hope for our future.
That was such a great prompter shift from one to the other. The only slightly interesting moment came in his very first lines when the president was thanking some of the dignitaries for being there, and he said this about Nevada Senator Dean Heller.
Dean Heller is here someplace or will shortly be here. He's caught the first flight out. So I want to thank Dean Heller, Senator, for being here.
That's what you're supposed to say about the senator from Nevada when you're in Nevada, especially when that senator is in your own party. But in last night's performance by the Jekyll and Hyde presidency in Arizona, the Republican president of the United States attacked both Republican senators from Arizona, both of whom boycotted the Trump event, one of whom is up for re-election next year, and the other is suffering from brain cancer. Here's how Donald Trump attacked Arizona Senator John McCain last night in Arizona.
Think of it. 7 years, the Republicans, and again, you have some great senators, but we are one vote away from repeal. But you know, they all said, Mr. President, your speech was so good last night. Please, please, Mr. President, don't mention any names. So I won't. I won't. No, I won't vote. One vote away. I will not mention any names. Very presidential, isn't it? Very presidential.
No, it was not very presidential. It was deplorable. It was strategically stupid for a president who is going to be begging for John McCain's vote on other bills, and it was utterly indecent. John McCain is suffering from a glioblastoma tumor in his brain. Googling glioblastoma could tell someone in the White House just how darkly serious that is, but no decent human being would have to know the details of glioblastoma to simply publicly wish John McCain well in his battle with brain cancer. As you're standing there in front of a crowd in John McCain's home state in Phoenix, Arizona. But Donald Trump has no sense of decency. He never has. He never will. And so he could go into a public rally in Arizona and attack the Arizona senator in his own party who is suffering from brain cancer. And he could ignore and never even mention the 10 Navy sailors who lost their lives on the USS John McCain, the Navy ship named for Senator McCain's father and grandfather, who both served as admirals in the United States Navy. Donald Trump is the only president to have lost 17 Navy sailors in 2 accidents at sea in 2 months. And Donald Trump can stand on a stage before the grieving families of those sailors have even been able to have the funerals. And he can completely ignore those dead Navy sailors, completely ignore them, not say one word about them, not mention one name. That is something no other president would ever have done, but it is because Donald Trump has no decency, absolutely none. And he is increasingly despised by senators in his own party because of his public attacks on Senator John McCain, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and also last night, the junior senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake, who has written a recently published book about how harmful Trumpism is to the Republican Party.
And nobody wants me to talk about your other senator, who's weak on borders, weak on crime, so I won't talk about him. Nobody wants me to talk about him.
Jeff Flake voted for the Trump-McConnell health care bill in the Senate, and so what Republican senators know tonight is Donald Trump will attack you if you vote against his legislation, as John McCain did, and Donald Trump will attack you if you vote for his legislation, as Jeff Flake did. There are indications that the Trump crowd isn't really buying it anymore. Jenna Johnson of the Washington Post, who was there in Arizona last night, filed this report. Many in the crowd lost interest in what the president was saying. Hundreds left early, while others plopped down on the ground, scrolled through their social media feeds, or started up conversation with their neighbors after waiting for hours in 107-degree heat to get into the rally hall, where their water bottles were confiscated by security people, were tired and dehydrated, and the president just wasn't keeping their attention. The president's most important lie last night was about himself. He lied about what he said on the day Heather Heyer was murdered in Charlottesville, when she was participating in a demonstration against Nazis and white supremacists. The president pulled out of his pocket what he said were his comments on that Saturday, and he read them to the crowd, and then he accused all of us in the news media of lying about what he had said that day. And in that moment, the president lied to his audience and to the country about what he said on that Saturday. It is a provable lie, but because the president is a pathological liar, he tells lies that can be instantly proved to be lies, and that's what we did last night during this hour. We interrupted the Trump speech to point out that he was lying about what he said himself. Here is how he quoted himself last night.
So here's what I said, really fast. Here's what I said on Saturday. We're closely following the terrible events unfolding in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is me speaking. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence. That's me speaking on Saturday.
And he was lying, of course, because he left out the part where he said, on many sides, on many sides.
We're closely following the terrible events unfolding in Charlottesville, Virginia. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
On many sides. Donald Trump willfully left out the words "on many sides" last night when he was quoting himself, because he knew that those were the words that were criticized in most of the media and by politicians in both parties. And Donald Trump was afraid to say the words "on many sides" last night when he was quoting himself, because he knows those are the words that got him in trouble. His deliberate refusal to quote himself saying those words is his own admission that he knows he should not have said those words, that those words are indefensible. His refusal to say those words last night is Trump's confession that he knows that the people who criticized those words were right. And if he said it again, he would be attacked for saying it again, and the people attacking him would be right again. And so Donald Trump very consciously did not say those words. He very consciously did not quote himself when he was pretending to his audience to be quoting himself. Here were the choices that the president had last night in that part of his speech. Don't bring up that subject at all. Leave it all behind him. That is no doubt what his new chief of staff, General Kelly, recommended that he do. That would have been the smart political choice after having made the horribly stupid and awful and egregious and immoral political choice of having said those words in the first place. Or the other thing the president could do, the president could defend what he said about Charlottesville after the murder of Heather Heyer. But to defend what he said, he was going to have to misquote what he said. To defend what he said, the president was going to have to lie about what he said. That is the choice that no politician would make. Only a very sick mind would make that choice. Publicly defend what I said by lying about what I said in a way that will be immediately caught and on MSNBC at least immediately contradicted in the middle of the speech, so that the audience will know that I'm lying as I'm saying it. And that is the choice that Donald Trump made last night. It is the kind of choice he will make again and again, because Donald Trump is a pathological liar, and his pathology will be flooding the news media and, for the most part, overwhelming the news media for as long as his presidency lasts. No White House chief of staff will ever be able to cure what ails Donald Trump.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.